Hello, today we're going to move on to step 2 for weaving. So what you need is some yarn, scissors, a loom, and a weaving needle. What I'm doing right here is I'm starting with some yarn and I'm tying it onto a string towards the bottom of the loom. I'm double knotting it. And I've attached it to my weaving needle. Now when you begin weaving, you want to make sure that you're going over, under, and so you're always alternating back and forth around your string. It's always helpful to hold on to it with your fingers so you don't get knots. Now when you move on to the other side, you want to make sure what thread was over or under before you started, so you make sure you're still alternating even as you switch sides. So again, you're holding on to the string so you don't get knots. And then check that it's under, and then you start over on the other side. So I'm going to start to speed up the video quite a bit here. So again, making sure you're alternating. So if you notice your thread is not alternating, you need to make sure you back up and then find the spot where the initial mistake is and then start over from that point. So we're going to zoom in really fast. I'm going to repeat this a few times. Once you get the hang of it, it's pretty mindless. You can do whatever you need to do while you're doing it. Watch TV or a movie or something. And then once you've got about 3 or 4 rows, you're going to kind of pack down the yarn. And the tighter you pack it, the less you'll see the warp thread, which would be that pink thread on the loom. If you pack it down really tight, you won't see it at all, and that's usually the desired effect. Especially if you're making a pouch, you want to make sure it's tight so that nothing falls through it. So we'll repeat the process again, make 3 or 4 rows, and then we'll pack it down again. So we've zoomed ahead to get to a point where we've run out of yarn. So here's how you're going to attach yarn. You can just tie 2 pieces of yarn together, do kind of a loop knot, make sure it's tight. You don't want it falling apart in the middle of this process. And then you're going to keep weaving with the knot. Now the knot's going to get stuck on the thread as you're working with it, and that's okay. You just need to be patient and kind of wiggle it through the loom. You'll see that in just a second here. So now we can see the knot starting to get stuck. So just kind of push it through, and then when you pack the yarn down, you want to make sure that the knot is, or the extra yarn is on the outside, because we're going to be flipping this over. So now we're at the point where we're going to make a flap. So usually we draw lines. I ended up changing my lines that you see there. And I like to start a new piece of yarn when I start the flap. That way I don't have to worry about having bits hanging out on the flap portion. So I always make sure that I have a lot of yarn for this section. That way I won't run out. So when we do the flap, we're going to stay on one side only. So only on the back side. And I made a little mark with a Sharpie to tell me where to stop. Now, when we start the flap, even though we're on one side, what I like to do is kind of grab the 2 strings on the outer edges of the front side and kind of pull them around. And why I do that is it kind of helps to keep the flap from getting too thin, because when you pull in on it, it starts to get skinny. So when I grab those other 2 sides, it keeps kind of a good thickness. So I wrap my needle around the outside edges. You can see that happening right there. I just kind of grab it and wrap around. So here I've finished the flap, and now I'm cutting off the warp threads. So before I remove stuff, I need to tie the threads off so that my yarn doesn't come undone. So again, you'll want to double knot and then make sure that the threads are actually going around the yarn so that it's not pointless. We want to make sure that it's every other thread that we're tying together. So the first one, we need to make sure we're tying in the last piece of yarn so that it stays. And then we just grab the threads that wrap around the yarn and then we tie it around that last piece of yarn and double knot it. So when we're doing the tying, it's really important that we make sure there's still enough thread left at the top that it's easy enough to handle. So unless if you're really good at using 1/4 of an inch of yarn or of thread to tie a knot, you want to make sure you have at least an inch to give you some leeway to work with. And so it gets a little confusing tying the knots off this way, so sometimes it helps to just cut a few pieces of thread off at a time so that you aren't overwhelmed with a whole bunch of thread. And then once you finish the flap portion, you can turn it around and start on the other side and do the exact same thing. This side's a little bit easier as you have a bit more thread to work with when you're tying it off. The only thing that's going to happen though is that you will have one extra piece of thread at the end. So you're going to have 3 pieces instead of 2. And basically all you need to do with that portion, as you can see there's the 2 extra pieces. You'll just hold those 2 together and tie them as one knot. And now you're ready to take it off of the loom. And this is the really awkward part because you do have that inside piece of thread that's taped in there. So you kind of have to wiggle your hand in and pull the tape off and pull the thread out of that notch. So you gotta squeeze in and then pull off of the loom. And there is going to be that thread down there in the first piece of yarn that you started with right there. So you're going to flip it over and you're going to tie the piece of warp thread to your yarn, and that's going to keep it from unraveling. Alright, so now we just turn the pouch inside out and kind of mush it around and get it into place how we like it, and then you are ready to decorate.